Well, once upon a time, in a land not far, far away, in fact, just around the corner, in a time not that long ago, about 8 years, there was a minister who wasn't really a minister. And we don't need to go into that story, except it does have some bearing. She was a minister because the king had asked her to be in charge of his energy efficiency army and his energy efficiency strategy and the solar water heating program she had proposed. But she was not really a minister because the chief of the goblins had told the king that he would not support the king if this person was ever a minister or any of her greenie colleagues were. Now, her name, as dictated by Say, was Icarus. Icarus loved being close to the sun. In fact, she lived very close to the sun in a little house which was entirely solar powered. And a part of that was a solar water heater, a very simple piece of technology which had been installed when the house was built for about $2,500. After 10 years was still working perfectly, had never had anything done to it, produced more hot water than the household could use all summer, and a reasonable contribution in winter. And Icarus thought that it would be really good if others of the king's subjects could also benefit from this technology. So she devised a plan. The problem was that solar water heaters had become really expensive, and it was hard to see why they were so expensive for such a simple piece of technology. So she thought, here is where government could make a difference. So she drew up this plan whereby the government would hold a competitive tender, because she was actually a believer in the free market, a competitive tender for the bulk supply of solar water heaters, and would then choose maybe 3 or 4 or 5 models that were the best quality, the most cost effective, and which suited different situations. The government would then purchase these at a bulk price and make them available to the king's subjects at cost. Well, this seemed like a great plan, and the barons who ran the solar water heating industry, and there were a lot of barons, they had their own association of barons. And when Icarus met with the Association of Barons, they thought she was the fairy godmother. She had turned up to greatly increase their sales and make them all rich, until they heard her plan. And all of a sudden, she changed from being the fairy godmother into being the wicked witch of the West. Because this was going to interfere with their relationship with their customers. This was the state getting involved in the market. This was going to drive down costs, and if you drive down costs, you also drive down profits. And the industry hated the idea. The king also hated the idea. The king said, we're not going to put the king's treasury into a bulk purchase of solar water heaters that we might not be able to on-sell. No, 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 you'll have to do it differently. So, okay, Icarus said, we will have to redesign this idea. And with the help of the king's army, they spent quite a bit of time trying to do that. But there were problems with some in the king's army, the king's energy efficiency army, who said, well, why should we take too much notice of a general who isn't a real general? And so that created some difficulties, and it was about 2 years before the king's army had really accepted that this was for real, and that the minister who wasn't really a minister was actually supposed to be in charge. Anyway, they did a lot of work on redesigning the scheme, but of course it was 6 months into the 3-year period before they had policy clearance from the King's Council, and also that the holder of the King's Treasure House had released the money. So you're already 1/6 of the way through your period for implementing a program before anything can really happen. Meanwhile, stories were starting to reach Icarus about the way that the industry worked. one of her neighbours, it turned out, had worked as an installer of solar water heaters a few years before, and said, you realise that the barons actually have a cartel, that there are masses of them, which ought to lead to lots of competition. But they actually have an agreement that life is a lot easier selling a few systems at a high markup than it would be selling a lot of systems at a low markup. And so you'll find that prices don't vary very much across the industry. And he talked about the things he had to sign when he was working for the industry, and this started to raise alarm bells with Icarus. She also found that the simple way of doing this was just to dole out some money, which the King's Treasury had by now released, to encourage householders to put solar water heaters on their roofs. But this meant there was going to be no control of quality and there was going to be no control of cost. And Icarus said, I don't want to do it that way. And the soldiers in the army said, well, you're making this very difficult. But other stories came to light. For example, there were the wise wizards. The wise wizards were located in places like universities, and they went out and they did stuff called research, and they discovered that in the real world, on the ground, there were lots of solar water heaters installed that didn't save any energy at all. And the reason for this was they had their thermostats at the bottom of the tank. So the family got up in the morning, they had their showers at 7 o'clock, cold water entered the tank at the bottom, the power immediately came on and brought the whole tank up to operating temperature. The sun came out at 9 o'clock, but there was nothing for it to do all day. The family came home and had more showers in the evening, and the power came on and heated up the water again, and actually the solar wasn't allowed to warm up the water in the tank. And this was remarkably common. Of course, when confronted with this, the barons said, oh, no, we have good quality control. And Icarus said, well, maybe some of the problem is with the people installing these things. Now, where's the training scheme? Oh, there is no training in New Zealand for installing solar water heaters. Each baron trains their own work staff, but they then have to sign an agreement they won't go and work for anybody else, ever. And how they train them is anybody's guess. But it's all right because they have to be signed off by these gnomes who are master craftsmen plumbers. And they have done all of this training, and so they know what they're doing. And you can't put in a solar water heater in New Zealand unless it's signed off by a craftsman plumber. Okay, well that looks like good quality control. So what is the training that master plumbers do? Where is the module on solar water heating? There wasn't any. So you can become a master plumber without doing anything in your training at all about solar water heating. All you know about is not having the water part of it leak. So that didn't seem to help. So Icarus decided we have to have some training schemes for people installing these things. And we have to make the money from the King's Treasury, which we don't want to waste, contingent on it being installed by somebody who's done this training. So eventually, with the help of the King's soldiers, training schemes were instituted in most of the polytechs in the country, and that may have solved some of the problems that were happening. They were still enormously expensive. Then the television program occurred. Somebody had found one make of solar water heater which was discoloured after only a few years on the roof. And was this corrosion? And there was a big hoo-ha, and all the king's horses and all the king's men fretted and ran around in circles trying to figure out what to do about this negative publicity for solar water heaters. The barons, of course, said, oh, we have very good internal quality control, you don't need to worry about this at all. But there were actually no real quality standards. There were bits and pieces, but there needed to be a way of ensuring that the system, not just its individual components, would perform as expected. So the soldiers said, okay, we need to set up, we can't really use any other countries' quality testing, we have to set up our own. I can't actually at the moment remember what the reason for that was, but anyway, a quality testing rig was set up somewhere in the South Island and schemes had to go through that. But of course the barons had to pay to have their systems tested, and they didn't like that at all. And it seemed like everything that Icarus tried to do to make sure that the king's treasure chest was spent on quality systems that were properly installed simply raised the cost. There were other problems with the barons. They had a business model that Icarus, who was not a business person and had never run a business and really knows nothing about these things at all, thought wasn't very sensible. Their method of selling a solar water heater was you spend all day in front of a windy stall at a home show advertising your wares, or you put an ad in the paper and then you get people ring you interested in a quote. You then travel in your van to the other side of the city where you go right through the house and you estimate how it would be done in that house and what they're going to need, and you then go back for half a day and you do the paperwork and you send them a quote. That's a day out of your time. You've probably got to do 5 of those in order to get one order, because there are so many barons all with their own little business. And then when you do get an order, you load up your van with the materials you need for one installation. You trundle across to the other side of the city, you install it. You may be a master plumber, or you may get a master plumber to come in and check the plumbing, but you get it signed off, and then there's a lot of paperwork to do. And that's a business model, it seems. So Icarus suggested, in her naivety and ignorance of business procedures, to the Association of Barons, why don't you try doing it this way? Find a subdivision all built around the same time with similar houses, where the water cylinders might be expected to be failing sometime round about now. Do a letterbox drop saying, if you order a solar water heater in the next month, I'll give you this much off. You collect your orders, you send in a container load of gear with your crew, some high-priced plumbers and some low-priced builders' labourers, because you don't actually need a master plumber to lift the things onto the roof. They work in a team, they go through several installations in a day, there's very little travel, you order them in bulk and then you send in the bill. But she was actually not a business person, and this was such a bad plan that nobody in the industry ever took up that idea. They continued selling them one at a time and trundling backwards and forwards across the city to install them. She never quite understood why. One of the very, very senior barons actually had put in an installation with some financial support, I have to say, from a previous scheme from the King's soldiers. It was a big installation on a public building, and it was rows of panels, and it turned out that at midday the front row shaded the second row, which shaded the third row. And it was some time before this was discovered. So this all added to Icarus's feelings that this industry is not in a good shape to carry out a major program of getting people closer to the sun. Then there was the matter of consent fees. Industry were very vocal about the fact that wider councils require a building consent to put a solar water heater in, and this costs a building consent fee of anything up to $1,000 with some councils, down to very little in other councils. This seems unnecessary. Surely if it's done to an agreed procedure by a trained installer with a certified system, the council ought to be able to waive the fee. So Icarus, who was a very busy little minister that wasn't really a minister, got around and talked to a whole lot of the councils and a whole lot of the mayors, and she got a whole raft of them agreed to waive the consent fees. So this was going to help bring the price down to consumers. They still required a consent, but they said they wouldn't charge for it. And then the stories started coming in. Well, this council, which isn't charging for consents, actually contracts out the issuing of consents, and the contractor still charges for their work. And then there was the problem that they don't charge for the consent, but they require a very complicated track of paperwork, and the compliance with this paperwork takes half a day of the installer's time, and they charge for the compliance costs. So it's almost as bad as it was before. And just today, someone I was talking to told me about going into Placemakers at the time that the scheme was running, where they had a big sign. At that stage, it was $1,000. No, it was $500 off a solar water heater if it's an approved system, and we sell the approved systems and we can find the installer. She said, Jim, do you sell many of these? He says, oh, we've only sold 4. Yeah, a lot of people are interested, but when we give them the paperwork they've got to fill in to satisfy the King's soldiers, they have a look at it and say, oh, this is not worth the $500, and they just go ahead without it. So the more you try to safeguard quality and effectiveness, the more you build costs into a project which sort of ring really simple. So a project which should have been really simple turned into a cross between Alice in Wonderland and Kafka over this 3-year period. Now, I don't think Icarus would claim that nothing was achieved in that time, and probably the main thing that was achieved was some better quality standards and some better training in the industry, rather than a huge number of solar water heaters actually installed. The whole thing was, of course, eventually cut short by the court jester. Court jester waves his wand every 3 years. The court jester waved his wand, the king was gone, a new king came in. The new king was not interested in getting closer to the sun and actually thought all energy should come out of the ground, so there was no further work done after that. And the minister is no longer a minister of any sort, real or otherwise. So that is the end of the story. What can we learn from it?